Friends, today is Saturday, the 8th of August, and it's the feast of St. Dominic. And we're in the cathedral, obviously, a little dark this morning for a summer day, but still the light of the saint shines upon us. St. Dominic, you know, the history of the church, we've been around long enough and many centuries, one begins to see a certain pattern with the saints, and that is that great saints arise when great need arises. And St. Dominic is one of those saints. 12th century, 13th century saint, kind of contemporary of St. Francis. And Dominic started out in a very small way, which is typical of all the great things that happen in the church. They start small. He was with his bishops on a mission to the south of France, dealing with a heresy called Catharism, or the Cathars. And the Cathars were a kind of dualistic religion. They were Christian or Catholic, or thought they were, but kind of went off the deep end. The dualism was in kind of two gods. One God, a good God of the New Testament, and a bad God of the Old Testament. Well, obviously that's not going to work. And so St. Dominic, with his bishop, they found themselves staying in an inn in the south of France, and it turns out that the innkeeper was a Cathar, which, by the way, means pure, the pure ones. Anytime you run into a group who call themselves the pure ones, you want to be careful, because you're not one of them. And they will, of course, judge you accordingly. In any case, what Dominic found was that it wasn't so much that they didn't have faith, but it was a very misdirected, misguided, misunderstood faith. And once he began to teach them the truth of the Catholic Church, they were kind of reconverted. And thus Dominic saw that the important thing for the church at the time was to be a good teacher, understand the theology of the church, and a good preacher. And thus began the order of preachers, OP, Order of Preachers, St. Dominic being the founder. Typically starting out small, but look at the Dominican order today after so many centuries of great saints and teaching, Thomas Aquinas included. So we call that group, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, mendicants. Mendicants. It was a new movement in the church. Mendicant, the word means beggars. They simply begged. They went from town to town, preaching and teaching, and begged for their livelihood. So we give thanks. We give thanks today for St. Dominic, and our readings today emphasize, of course, something that St. Dominic was preaching as well, and that is faith. Faith, and the importance of faith. The context of our reading today, which is a healing miracle story, a man comes to Jesus and presents his son, whom he calls a lunatic, which of course doesn't sound too good to us today, but it means simply a person who was moonstruck, luna, moon, and that's the way they understood it at the time, that the phases of the moon would influence people. And this man's son, it sounds like epilepsy. He would throw himself into fire, throw himself into water, and his father, of course, was concerned about him. And thus he brings him to Jesus. And he says that the disciples could not cure him, and thus that's why they bring him to Jesus. And Jesus says, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long will I be with you? How long will I endure you?" Is he speaking here of the Father or someone else? The context would indicate that he is speaking about the disciples and their lack of faith, unable to perform this miracle. Little bigger context, this reading today follows right after the Transfiguration. I mentioned yesterday that the context of the Transfiguration, both before and after, are important. Before, Jesus predicts his passion. The disciples are sad and worried and fearful. And thus Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain, and they see the glory of Jesus revealed. They see where this road is going. The understanding of the passion and the death leading to glory. And now they come down the mountain and back into reality. Similar to Moses, Matthew wants us to think of Moses on Mount Sinai, going up, receiving the law, coming back down and finding a pandemonium that he had to take care of, worshiping the golden calf and so on. Now Jesus comes down and finds the same issues, the same, whether faith or lack of faith or just the needs of the people. And he is there, of course, to help. The overriding theme of the readings today is that of faith. In fact, the responsorial psalm today, where is that? Hold on just a moment. Not the responsorial, but the first reading from the prophet Habakkuk. It says, "The rash man has no integrity, but the just man, because of his faith, will live." As I was thinking about today's gospel reading and the disciple, I couldn't help but think of the words of St. Paul in his second letter to the Corinthians. We walk by faith and not by sight. We walk by faith and not by sight. How important are those words? How familiar we are with those words. We walk by faith and not by sight. One of the great hymns we sing includes those words. But what do they mean? And do we walk by faith and not by sight? It means that we don't throw reason out the window, that like faith somehow is in opposition to reason. No, it's a new way of seeing, putting on new eyes, we might say, or even a new mind, the mind of Christ, and seeing the world in a different way, walking through the world, not just with our physical sight, but with the sight of faith. And in that sight, seeing the work of God everywhere, being able to, in a sense like the Transfiguration, the veil is lifted, and we see the presence of God. We may not understand and why things are the way they are, all of that. But what faith gives us is trust. Trust and faith are like two sides of the same coin. Trust that God is present so that we should not be afraid, that we should not worry. God is always acting. And it may not be evident to us. It may be just like that little mustard seed mentioned in the gospel today. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, and frankly, probably most of us do, how powerful that tiny little seed is. Like St. Dominic, he was, in a sense, a mustard seed too, just a little individual. But what great work he did. With that little bit of faith, Jesus says we can move mountains if we just trust. We walk by faith and not by sight. Hold on to those words, and we'll see you tomorrow.